For 38 years, Sandra Kowalski had been the kind of judge people described with words like formidable and unyielding, which was a polite way of saying she scared them. She had built her reputation in the Edmonton courthouse one verdict at a time, case by case, year after year, until her name became shorthand for something harder than justice. Efficiency, certainty. A woman who never wavered and never under any circumstances let what she felt show on her face. People said she had ice in her veins. Sandra had heard it so many times she stopped registering it as an insult. She had been appointed to the bench at 41. The youngest woman in Alberta to receive that honor. She had sacrificed 2 marriages, a decade of weekends, and most of her friendships to get there. The courtroom was her life. The gavel was the only thing she had ever held with complete confidence. And for a long time, that was enough. Then, 14 months ago, her hand stopped working. It started small. A tremor in the right hand during a sentencing. She had pressed her fingers flat against the bench and waited for it to pass. It did. She told herself it was exhaustion and booked a massage she never actually went to. 3 weeks later, the tremor came back, worse. And this time it brought a companion. A stiffness that crept up from her wrists each morning like her joints were filling with concrete overnight. By November, she was dropping things. By January, she had a diagnosis. Early onset Parkinson's disease. The neurologist, a kind man named Dr. Fernandez who chose his words with obvious care, told her they had caught it relatively early, that medication could manage the progression, that many people lived full and productive lives. Sandra had sat in the chair across from him, hands folded deliberately in her lap, and nodded at all the right moments. She asked 3 precise questions about medication protocols and side effects. She thanked him for his time. She drove herself home, sat in the parking garage for 40 minutes, and did not cry. Sandra did not cry. That was simply not something she did. What she did instead was work harder. She restructured her mornings to accommodate the medication schedule. She had her courtroom clerk start handling the papers she needed to sign so no one would see her hands tremble before the drugs kicked in. She told no one except her sister in Winnipeg, who called every Sunday and always opened with "How are you actually doing?" And Sandra always said "Fine," really in a tone that closed the topic immediately. She had a daughter. Renata was 12, sharp as a tack, and had her mother's dark eyes and her father's, Sandra's first husband's, ability to see straight through people. Renata knew something was wrong. Sandra could tell by the way the girl watched her at the breakfast table too carefully, too quietly, the way children watch adults when they are afraid to ask the question directly. Sandra had not told her. She kept telling herself she was waiting for the right moment, which was another way of saying she was afraid. They lived in a townhouse in the west end of Edmonton. Tidy, sensible, nothing excessive. Sandra's salary was comfortable, but she had 2 mortgages, her own and the one she had co-signed for her mother before her mother passed, and Renata's school fees and the Parkinson's medication, which was more expensive than Dr. Fernandez had made it sound. She was managing, barely, but managing. On a Wednesday in late February, Sandra was in her chambers between sessions when the pain hit her. Not the usual stiffness. Something sharper, an electric current that ran up the back of her right hand and locked her fingers in place. She pressed her palm to the desk and breathed through it. The medication had been slightly adjusted the week before, and her body was still calibrating. She knew this. She also knew that in 22 minutes, she was due back in courtroom 4 for the afternoon session, and she could not walk in there with her hand locked into a claw. She pressed her intercom and told her clerk, a steady young woman named Beth, that she needed 5 more minutes. Beth said of course, no problem, and Sandra sat alone in her chambers and focused on breathing until her hand released, and the tremor settled into something manageable. She made it through the afternoon session. She always made it through. Evening she picked up Renata from her after-school program and they drove home mostly in silence, which was their comfortable silence, the kind that didn't need filling. Renata was reading in the passenger seat. Sandra glanced at her daughter's profile in the glow of passing streetlights and felt the particular ache that comes from loving someone and being unable to tell them the truth. The Thursday morning started like every other. Sandra was out the door at 7:15. Renata dropped at school. Coffee from the Tim Hortons drive-through that she drank while reviewing the day's case files at a red light. She was 5 minutes from the courthouse when the delivery truck in front of her braked suddenly and she braked too, and the coffee went into her lap, and she said one word she would not want Renata to hear, and she pulled into a parking lot to assess the damage. Her jacket was salvageable. Her blouse was not. She had a spare jacket in chambers, but nothing else. She sat in the parking lot calculating whether she had time to go home and change, and concluded she did not, and was in the process of accepting that she would be spending the day in a coffee-stained blouse beneath her robe when she noticed the dry cleaning shop across the street. The sign in the window said, "Express services 1 hour." She had never been inside it before. She had never noticed it before, which was typical of Sandra. She noticed what required her attention and filed the rest away as background. The shop was small and warm, and smelled like steam and soap. The counter was near the door, and behind it was a man around her age, maybe slightly younger, wearing a blue apron with a logo on the chest. He had dark circles under his eyes that suggested he had not slept enough in some time. The kind of tiredness that wasn't a bad night but an accumulation of months. He was folding something when she came in and he looked up immediately. "Morning," he said. Not good morning. Just morning, which Sandra appreciated for its honesty. She explained the coffee situation in 3 sentences. He looked at the blouse, considered it for 2 seconds, and said he thought he could get most of it out in 40 minutes if she could wait. No promises on the collar, but the rest should be fine. "I'll take it," Sandra said. He handed her a plastic-wrapped dry cleaning bag from a rack behind him. "You can change in the back room if you need to. It's just storage, but there's a mirror." She changed, came back out, handed him the blouse. He tagged it and disappeared into the back. Sandra sat in one of the 2 plastic chairs near the door and checked her phone. She had 37 minutes. 11 minutes passed. Then she heard a sound from the back room. A small voice, a child's voice, saying something she couldn't make out, and then the man's voice, lower, patient. She had not realized there was a child in the shop. She went back to her phone. A few minutes later the man came back to the counter, and with him came a boy maybe 5 years old, wearing a puffy winter vest and holding a coloring book. The boy climbed onto a stool behind the counter with the practiced ease of a child who had done this many times. "Sorry," the man said. Not apologetically exactly, more as an acknowledgement. "Daycare's closed this week. He comes with me on those days." "It's fine," Sandra said, which was the truth. Boy looked at her with the frank curiosity of young children. "Are you a lawyer?" he asked. "A judge," Sandra said. The boy considered this. "Do you have a hammer?" "A gavel?" Sandra said. "Yes." He seemed satisfied with this and returned to his coloring book. The man, his name she would learn later was Thomas, made a small sound that might have been a suppressed laugh. He went back to work. Sandra watched the boy color for a moment, a concentrated effort with a yellow crayon, tongue slightly out. Something about the picture settled her somehow. She couldn't have explained it. The morning's tension, the parking lot, the ruined blouse, the hand that still wasn't fully cooperating. It all receded slightly in the warmth of that small shop. Then her right hand spasmed. It was a bad one. She had been gripping her phone, and her fingers locked around it suddenly, and she made an involuntary sound. Not a cry, more a sharp breath. And the phone clattered to the floor. She bent to retrieve it, and her hand wouldn't close properly. And she was kneeling there on the floor of a dry cleaning shop trying to pick up her phone with fingers that weren't responding. And for the first time in 14 months she felt not just the physical pain, but the humiliation underneath it. The helplessness she spent every waking hour refusing to feel. She got the phone. She sat back in the chair. She arranged her expression. Thomas was already around the counter. He had moved quietly. He crouched down at her level, not hovering, not panicking, just present, and said quietly, "Do you need a minute?" Sandra looked at him. She intended to say no, "I'm fine, please continue with the blouse," but what came out instead was nothing, because her throat had closed in a way it almost never did. Thomas didn't push. He stood, went behind the counter, came back with a glass of water, and set it on the chair beside her without comment. Then he went back to work. His son, still on the stool, had looked up from the coloring book during all of this. He looked at Sandra for a moment with those serious 5-year-old eyes. Then he tore a page carefully out of his book. A drawing he had already partially colored. A yellow sun and some blue shapes that might have been birds or waves, it was hard to tell, and climbed down from the stool and walked over and placed it on the chair beside the water. He said, "This is for you, because you look like you need a picture." Sandra looked at the drawing. Her throat tightened further. "Thank you," she managed. He nodded very seriously and climbed back onto his stool. Thomas brought her blouse back in 38 minutes. Most of the stain was gone. He had gotten the collar too. He charged her $12, and when she tried to give him 15, he shook his head and said 12 was the price. She paid it. She folded the boy's drawing carefully and put it in her bag, which she did not think about again, until she was robing in chambers and found it tucked in the side pocket and sat down, quite suddenly, in her chair. That afternoon she couldn't concentrate. This was unprecedented. Sandra's concentration was legendary, her ability to hold complexity, to track testimony, to see through the noise of a courtroom to the essential truth underneath. Today, mid-testimony, She found herself thinking about a 5-year-old on a stool with a coloring book and a man who had brought her water without being asked. She went back the following Tuesday. She didn't have anything that needed dry cleaning. She told herself she was returning the plastic bag she had borrowed to change in, which was true, though it was also the thinnest possible reason. Thomas was there, the boy. His name was Callum, was not, it being a regular school day. Thomas took the bag and thanked her. She asked him, because she didn't know how else to start a conversation, how long he had been running the shop. He said 4 years, since his wife passed. He said it plainly, the way people do when they've said something many times and found the simple version is easier than the elaborate one. "I'm sorry," Sandra said. "It was hard," he said. "It's still hard. But Callum's good, he keeps things clear." She asked what he meant. He said that when you have a kid who needs you, you don't have the option of disappearing into your grief. You have to show up. You make his breakfast, you take him to school, you answer his questions about why the sky is blue and whether dogs go to heaven, and somewhere in the showing up you realize you are still alive. And the grief is still there, but it has a different shape. It doesn't fill the whole room anymore. Sandra stood at the counter of his dry cleaning shop for 20 minutes. She wasn't sure afterward what exactly they had talked about. His wife, her courtroom, Callum's recently developed obsession with anything related to volcanoes, Renata and her school project on the St. Lawrence River. It was a conversation without agenda, which was a kind of conversation Sandra almost never had. Every exchange in her life had a purpose and a conclusion. This one just moved. She came back the Thursday after that, and the one after that. By April she had told Thomas about the Parkinson's. She hadn't planned to. She had been describing a case, not with names, just the shape of it, a sentencing she was struggling with. And she said something about how her hands weren't cooperating, and Thomas had looked at her, not with the careful blankness people used when they didn't know how to respond to something, but directly. And she had told him. All of it. The parking garage, the 40 minutes, the decision not to cry. Dr. Fernandez and his kind, careful words. Renata watching her at the breakfast table. Thomas had listened without interrupting, which was rarer than people thought. When she finished, he said, "Does Renata know?" "No, why not?" Sandra had a prepared answer to this question. She had given it to herself 100 times. But something about the way he asked it, without judgment, without the softness people used when they were trying to protect you from your own logic, made the prepared answer feel hollow. She looked at the counter. Because I don't know how to tell her without it becoming the thing that defines everything. Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "She already knows something. Kids that age always know. The only thing she doesn't know is the truth, and the truth is easier to carry than the thing you're imagining." Sandra went home that evening and sat on the edge of Renata's bed after Renata's light was supposed to be out, and she told her daughter about the Parkinson's. She told her what it was, what it meant, what the doctors said, what it didn't mean. Renata listened with those dark, serious eyes, and when Sandra finished, Renata said, "I know, Mom. I looked it up in November. I just didn't know if you wanted me to ask." Sandra said, "Why didn't you say anything?" Renata said, "Because you looked like you needed me not to." Sandra held her daughter for a long time after that, which was not something they did often, not because they didn't love each other, but because they were both, in their own ways, their own people with their own edges. It felt like something unlocking. In May, Thomas's landlord raised the shop rent by $400 a month. Thomas told her about it matter-of-factly the next time she came in. The way he told her most things, without drama, as a statement of fact that required a response. He had 3 weeks to decide whether to renew the lease. The numbers were tight. He'd already cut his own salary twice in the past year to keep the part-time employee he had on Fridays. He said he was working on it. Sandra said nothing at the time. She went home and thought about it. She had, over the previous 2 months, told 2 people about Thomas and Callum. One was her sister in Winnipeg, who had said, "Sandra, are you telling me you have a friend?" in a tone of such delighted disbelief that Sandra had hung up on her. The other was Beth, her clerk, who had simply nodded and said that sounded like a good thing. Sandra was not a woman who made impulsive decisions. Everything she did moved through a deliberate process of consideration and analysis. But she had learned, over the past few months, that there was a category of decision her analytical process had never been designed to handle. Not legal decisions, not professional ones, but decisions about what actually mattered. She called her financial advisor. She looked at numbers. She thought about the second mortgage, and the medication and Renata's school. And she thought about a 5-year-old. Handing a drawing to a stranger in a dry cleaning shop. Because she looked like she needed a picture. She knew 3 people in Edmonton's business community who had been looking to invest in small local retail for the past year. She had heard this mentioned at a function she had attended in January and filed it away as irrelevant information, which it had been at the time. She made 3 phone calls. She explained the shop, the location, the owner's track record over 4 years, the existing customer base. She was not asking for charity. She was presenting an opportunity. 2 of the 3 called back. She did not tell Thomas what she was doing until it was concrete. She was aware this might be perceived as overreach. A woman accustomed to making decisions without consultation, extending that habit into someone else's life. She thought about this carefully. She decided that the difference between overreach and help was whether you were doing it for yourself or for them, and that Thomas was perfectly capable of saying no. She went in on a Tuesday afternoon, sat in the plastic chair, and told him what she had arranged. An investment offer from 2 local business people, enough to cover the increased rent for 2 years plus some equipment upgrades, in exchange for a small equity stake. No operational interference. Thomas would continue running the shop exactly as he always had. The investors had done their homework. They wanted in. Thomas listened. He looked at the counter for a moment. He looked at her. "Sandra," he said. "You can say no," she said. "Obviously. Why did you do this?" She considered giving him the practical answer, that it was a sound investment, that she had simply made an introduction, that it cost her nothing. All of which was true. She chose instead to say, "Because you're good at this. The shop, yes, but the other thing too, the way you show up. The way you talk to Callum. The way you handed me a glass of water when you could have pretended you didn't see. People like you should be able to keep doing what they're doing." Thomas was quiet for long enough that she wondered if she had misjudged. Then he said, "I'll think about it." He thought about it for 4 days and then called her and said, yes. There was a session with Dr. Fernandez in June during which he reviewed Sandra's recent assessments and told her, carefully, that her motor function scores from the latest round of tests showed less progression than he had modeled at this stage. Not a reversal. He was clear about that, and Sandra appreciated the clarity. But slower. He said that stress reduction and strong social support had documented neurological benefit in Parkinson's patients. He said whatever she was doing, she should keep doing it. She had smiled at him, which surprised him enough that he had made a note of it. The summer was the first in several years that felt, to Sandra, like something other than a gap between work periods. Renata came with her once to pick up a clean blazer. And Thomas and Renata had an extended conversation about the St. Lawrence project that turned into a discussion about hydroelectric systems that Sandra did not entirely follow but listened to with something that was close to happiness. Callum showed Renata his collection of volcano pictures. Renata, who had never shown particular interest in geology, was apparently won over by the one of Vesuvius. In September, Sandra received a commendation from the Alberta courts for a decision she had written the previous year. A long and carefully reasoned judgment on a case involving workers' rights that had been cited in 2 other provincial decisions since. At the ceremony, she was asked to say a few words. She gave a short speech about the importance of clear reasoning, of resisting the noise to find the essential thing, of returning always to what was actually true. Afterward, a colleague who had known her for 15 years said she seemed different. Softer was the word he used, then corrected himself quickly as if he expected her to object. Sandra said she wasn't sure softer was wrong. She thought about what Thomas had said months ago, about showing up, about how the act of being present for someone else, consistently unglamorously in the ordinary moments, was not a small thing dressed up as a large one. It was in fact the large thing, the rest was scaffolding. Her hand still shook in the mornings before the medication settled. She still had days when the stiffness was worse, and the cases were long, and she was aware, in a way she hadn't been before, of everything her body was doing to compensate for what it could no longer simply do. She did not minimize this. She had learned, slowly, and at some cost, that refusing to acknowledge difficulty was not the same as being strong. Being strong was acknowledging it, and continuing anyway. Renata had started leaving glasses of water on Sandra's nightstand without being asked. Sandra had noticed this in August and had said nothing, just drank the water, which was its own kind of conversation. On a Friday in October, Sandra picked up Renata from school and they drove to the dry cleaning shop, because Thomas had asked if they wanted to come by. Callum had made something at school he apparently needed to show them specifically. The boy presented Sandra with a drawing, not torn from a coloring book this time but on proper white paper, clearly worked on with great seriousness. It showed 4 people standing in front of a building with a blue sign. 2 were clearly adults, 1 tall and 1 shorter, and 2 were children of different heights. The sun was yellow and enormous and took up nearly a quarter of the page. "That's us," Callum said, pointing at the figures in turn. "That's you, and that's my dad, and that's Renata, and that's me." Sandra looked at the drawing. The figures had no detailed features, but they were all standing close together, their lines touching at the edges, and there was something in the composition. The boy's unconscious instinct about proximity and warmth. That said everything the picture was trying to say. "It's very good," Sandra said, and meant it completely. She had a collection of Callum's drawings now, 4 of them, kept in the top right drawer of her desk at home. People who worked very hard at things that mattered had framed certificates and honors on their walls, which Sandra had too, and she valued them. But the drawer was the thing she thought about sometimes in the afternoon sessions. When the courtroom was long and the gavel was heavy, and her hand was less certain than it once was, she would think about the drawer and the drawings and the glass of water without being asked, and the conversation that moved without agenda. And it would settle something, not fix anything, just settle it. The way a hand placed steadily on a shoulder doesn't solve anything but makes it possible to continue. That was enough. Most days, it was more than enough.